I'm starting a recording, which means that all of you should be advised that you're being recorded. So I hope you don't worry anyway, but that I guess the idea is there may be some liability if you don't tell people that they're going to be recorded and record them anyway. Okay, anyone else now? Sarah, welcome. Barbara, welcome. Dick, Jean. All right, it's time. It's actually past time. I got the best from me. Okay, we're going to start with a little prayer. Oh, excuse me. This is not the same prayer as last week. I didn't change the title. I changed the prayer though. This is a prayer for serenity. Most humble Saint Martin, your burning charity embraced all, especially the sick, the afflicted, and those in need. We turn to you in our present difficulties, seeking intercession. Please implore God on our behalf for this special request. And everyone, if they have their own personal request here. May imitating your submission to God's will bring us peace all our days. We know that you served others without seeking anything for yourself except a closer relationship to our crucified Lord. May we too find intimacy with Jesus through our care for the needy. O God, you invited Martin de Porres into your heavenly kingdom. Grant that through his merits and by his intercession, we may follow his example. Give us tranquility of spirit to address the problems that we face and accept as your will what we cannot change. We ask this through our Lord Jesus Christ, in the spirit of power and love. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, you've seen this before. We should be reading chapter 6, the sixth age of the church. The classes, I thought I posted the last class, which would have been class 13. I have to check it. Somebody said that they didn't see it. And then we have the shrine shirts if you wish to have a little souvenir, a little remembrance of the shrine. And those are, you can find the same information on our Shrine website. I want to begin tonight with just a little preview of our last classes. This is the 14th class, and there will be 20. Next week, we'll do the Church in the Enlightenment and the 19th century. And then the church in wartime, pretty much the first half of the 20th century. On February 17th, the day after Ash Wednesday, we'll have a class on the social teaching of the church, and then talk about Vatican II and the pontificate of John Paul II, that magnificent Pope of the last century. And then the penultimate class will be the Catholic Church in America. We'll go from colonial times and bring it pretty much up to date. Of course, we just had this very significant, a second Catholic was elected president. And we'll end on March 10th with a little bit of the church in the 21st century, but more a summary of all that we've covered this year. So that'll be 20 classes. I wanted to finish during Lent because the last part of Lent, I have another program that I hope some of you will be interested in. We'll let you know more about that in due time. Okay, just review of what we did last week and what we're hope to do tonight. Last week, remember, we had some considerations of the missions, how the mission is the work of the church. We remember what Pope St. Paul VI said, the church is more a mission with an institution than it is an institution with a mission. We talked about the missions in Latin America, how they had a eradicationist kind of policy. There was the missionaries did not think very much of the indigenous cultures, so they tried to suppress the cultures. Then we looked at the missionaries in Asia and how they used a different kind of strategy. There was a high regard for Buddhism and especially Confucianism in China, and so they tried to adapt some of the elements of the local culture into church teaching and practice. And then we ended with talking about the missions in North America. This week, we have a fairly large agenda. We'll look at the religious wars. The religious wars in France, quite bloody, quite extensive. And then I'll look at Catholicism in Elizabethan England. That was bloody, but more persecution than wars. And then finally, look at the tremendously costly war in Germany, the 30-year war. And we should get into the great French century, the time of Louis XIV, the 17th century France. Now, I want to just kind of test your memory, but really more just kind of a way of review. Who can answer? Please open your microphone if you want to answer. What is an eradicationist strategy and where was it practiced? Anybody? Eradicationist is eradicating the local culture. This was done pretty much throughout the
Latin America.
missions. Is somebody speaking? The missions in Latin America and an accommodationist strategy. What was that and where was it practiced? Go ahead, Michael.
Accommodation strategy was practiced mostly in the Far East, in China, where they tried to blend in the Catholic theology in with the culture, the current culture there.
Confucian philosophy especially, right.
Yes. And then it was also practiced, I believe, in Vietnam and India. And to a certain extent in California by the priests and the missionaries, but the colonialists, Spanish, the soldiers, they weren't leaning towards being accommodating as the missionaries were.
Well, we said that in Latin America, California, we didn't talk about California as a Latin American country. We talked about it as a North American country. You know, one thing though that was in a sense accommodationist in one sense in Latin America, there was a lot of intermarrying between the Spanish and the locals and the indigenous people. And in a sense, that's an accommodation. But where in North America, there hasn't been much marrying between the indigenous tribes and, say, the English settlers. Anyway, that's a side point, and it certainly wasn't what I had in mind when I asked the question, where was accommodationist strategy practiced? And you're right to say that it was practiced in Asia. Okay, what were the reductions and where were they found? Does he remember that? Anybody remember what the reductions were? These were the missions in Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay as well. And they were kind of colonies that the Jesuits founded, in order to keep the local culture intact, to protect the people from the exploitative ways of the colonists. And so they were these indigenous communities that the Jesuits came and and worked with, bringing them. As I understand it, they're much like what the Franciscan Juniper Serra did in California in the missions. It was kind of a society that was created that was relatively free from the colonists in both cases, in Brazil and Paraguay from the Portuguese colonists, and of course in California from some of the Spanish colonists. Okay, which is the great missionary of the American Southwest? I give you 4 names: Kino, Ricci, Nobili, or Jogues. Who can answer that? Anybody? Nobody wants to try? Okay, this is the great Jesuit missionary Eusebius Kino. He was an Italian Jesuit, evidently a very kind of knightly man. He went and founded these missions all over Arizona and northern Mexico, and probably California as well. Okay, what were the conquistadors looking for in the New World, in the newly discovered lands? That should be simple.
They were looking for the wealth. Gold.
They were looking for the wealth.
Gold.
Yeah, right.
Silver.
Especially the gold, the silver too, but they came looking for gold. And the missionaries, what were they looking for?
To save souls.
Yeah, very good. That's the word that we use. They were looking for conversions, but they would have probably said the same thing, saving souls. They came there to save souls. And even though some of the missionaries practiced heavy-handedness, there were some people were forced into baptism. Their motivation was high. They did want to save souls. And the final question, who is the bishop who defended the rights of indigenous Americans? Is it John Brebeuf, Francis Xavier, Juniper Serra, or Bartolomé de las Casas?
Francis Xavier.
No,
No?
Francis Xavier, of course,
in
with the Eastern
Bartholomew.
in Asia.
Jean Baroque.
No.
Bartholomew.
Jean Brebeuf was a French Jesuit in the who worked among the Hurons Indians in the American Northeast.
Bartolome.
There you go, Bartolomé de las Casas. Dominican friar, named the bishop of Chiapas, and then went back to Spain and defended the rights of the Indians. Controversial figure. Some people think he gravely exaggerated numbers of persecuted Indians, numbers of deaths of Indians. But anyway, he certainly did defend the rights of the Indians in a scholarly way back in Spain, as he worked with the indigenous for years, first as a Dominican friar, and then for only a couple years as bishop in Chiapas. Okay, that's last week, so we want to go ahead now.
Saturated the numbers.
And we'll to talk about the religious wars in France. in the 1550s, quite a bit of time after Luther, but Calvin was practicing. Remember, Calvin was like the second generation of Protestant reformers. He was practicing in Geneva, I think through the middle of the 1550s. But Calvinism was not welcome in France, and that's really why Calvin went to Switzerland, to Geneva, because he was not allowed to practice freely the religion. The King, Francis I, was very suspicious of the reform. He wanted the country to remain Catholic. There were several reasons why at first the Protestantism was contained. Then in the 1550s, the mother of the king, Francis II, was Catherine de' Medici, and she was more tolerant toward the Protestants. So Calvinism was started to be practiced in France. It was, of course, aided by the printing press, and they could publish all kinds of pamphlets and spread the word in this way. Most of the people in France weren't educated, but in the cities, especially amongst the, say, what we would think of the middle class today, the people could read, and they were influenced by the printed material. Ministers from Geneva came back to France, many of them French to begin with. They were educated in Geneva, and they came to France to preach to the people. Again, not so much in the country, but in the cities. There was a significant number of people. Also, the nobility were receptive to Protestant ideas. And they say that half of the nobles in France by 1560 were Protestant. Not half the country, but many of the people of influence, the nobles and the semi-educated, at least in the cities. Preaching, they emphasize preaching. Their ministers could preach well. There was always a problem with Catholics. The priests were not preaching well. These people trained to preach well, and they were able to make their mark. Okay, and then in 1562, after there was a significant number of Protestant converts, war broke out between the Catholics and the Protestants. There was always kind of a reactionary right in the Catholic Church that didn't want to tolerate Protestantism at all, and they were eager to exterminate the Protestants. So in the events leading up to 1562, King Henry II died in 1559, and his successor, brother Francis II, died in 1560, leaving the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, protecting the interest of her son, Charles IX, who was going to be king. And Catherine attempted toleration, but extremist Catholics opposed her. An incident in the town of Vassy resulted in the slaughter of 50 Huguenots. Now that's, I meant to look up why they call themselves Huguenots, and I didn't get around to it. But Huguenots are French Calvinists. This is the what they're called, and still called today. Not a very large minority, but a sizable number of French Protestants, and most of them, again, are these Huguenots or Calvinists. an incident in Vassy where there was a slaughter of 50 Huguenots started the first of 8 French wars of religion in 1562. Now, the dispute became primarily one of would a Protestant become king of France? And of course, for the Catholic, especially the extremists, that was unthinkable. And yet, Henry Navarre, who was a Protestant, was coming close to being in the line of succession. And because of a number of, unusual circumstances, he did eventually become king. The dispute was primarily over succession to the throne, with Catherine de' Medici speaking for Catholics and Henry of Navarre leading the Huguenots. These were kind of the leaders of the two sides. Again, Catherine was rather moderate, and Henry, as we'll see, evidently was moderate himself because he eventually became a Catholic. The Huguenots, though, they had the support, monetary support of German Protestants, while Spain assisted the Catholics. So we see this alignment in religion. Now, the alignment it didn't always take place, but at this point, early on, still relatively early on in the Protestant Reformation, the Protestants supported Protestants and Catholics supported Catholics. Okay, there was much local vandalism and violence between Catholics and Huguenots, as well as military warfare. The people themselves hurt one another. I mean, these weren't armies. These were local townspeople, Catholics, the Catholic gangs, the Protestant gangs doing violence, pillaging churches. The Protestants, the Calvinists, had a loathing for the Catholic images in churches, Catholic use of these images for worship. And so they might enter a church and destroy all the statues. And of course, Catholics had their own way of getting back. There weren't any statues to destroy in Protestant churches, but they certainly could victimize the people. Okay, and then in 1572, there was an incident, a very brutal, violent incident that really kind of brought the conflict to a new height and resulted in the loss of impetus on the part of the Huguenots. But anyway, the incident was called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in 1572. This happened at the royal wedding between the daughter of Catherine de' Medici, Marguerite of Valois, and Henry of Navarre. Again, Henry of Navarre, the Protestant. The wedding was intended to bring the two sides together. If these two royal figures can marry, at least noble figures can marry, the people should be able to lead in peace. But some of the Catholics took advantage of the fact that many of the Protestants were in Paris for this wedding, and there was a slaughter of 2,000 Huguenots on St. Bartholomew's Day, August 24th, 1572. And this was followed up with more violence in different cities, some counter-violence. But the Huguenots were decimated. They lost a lot of lives, and they realized that they weren't going to be able to overcome forcefully the Catholic forces in France. Some of the Huguenots returned to Catholicism. Others were determined to resist the intolerance, but they were going to have to be much more reserved, subtle about what they were going to do. Okay, so the struggle for the monarchy continued. Would a Protestant be accepted as king? That was the question throughout the rest of the century. Protestant Henry Navarre become the likely heir of the throne. A couple of transitions took place, and here he was, the one who was going to succeed to the throne because there was no male heir to the king. I forget the name of the French king at the time. He died, and then Henry Navarre was the next in line. And he did become king in 1589, but he couldn't get into Paris. The Catholic League, I think they called themselves, was very strong, and they just refused to let Henry come into Paris. If he was going to become king, he had to become a Catholic. So it is, the legend is that Henry Navarre said, Paris is worth a mass. So he became Catholic, went to mass, entered Paris as the king of France. And later on then in 1598, he issued the Edict of Nantes. Now, this is very significant, which allowed toleration of Protestant worship for the first time in France, that the Huguenots could practice in 200 little municipal areas that they had significant numbers, and then their nobles can practice the religion on their estate. So this was a concession on the part of the Catholics, ordered of the king. But at the same time, in the Edict of Nantes, Catholicism was proclaimed the official religion of the country. Before that, it was just taken for granted, but now just to assure the Catholics that the Protestants weren't going to take over. Catholic was the official religion. We call the conservative Catholics, and this is an important term because we hear it sometimes today, even though it doesn't apply today only to French conservative Catholics who wanted papal influence in France. They were called ultramontanes. The idea was ultramontanes, ultra beyond mountains, the mountains. The influence of the Pope, who lived beyond the mountains, who lived in Italy, of course, beyond the Alps, that he would have influence in France. And sometimes we say people today who want papal influence rather than say a national church. We call them ultramontanes. And if you want the national church, you call yourself cismountains. Cis, I forget the Latin meaning for that, but the idea is you don't go beyond the mountains. You stay your side of the mountains, and you have the church there. The church there forms its own policy. Of course, this is a traditional source of tension. Is the church local or is it universal? The diocese, in this case, the national church versus the universal church with the Pope as head. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the century, into the 17th century. There was a kind of détente between Catholics and Protestants. Catholics certainly had the upper hand, but Protestants were allowed to practice the faith. That's France. In a little while, if we get it at the end of the class, we'll talk about the Great French Century, and Catholicism undergoes a great revival, and the country is more associated with the Catholic Church than at this time with Henry Navarre. Okay, go to England now. let's see, move this. And we'll pick up when Elizabeth becomes becomes queen in 1558. She was queen, and at the beginning of her reign, there was this sense that she's not going to reign very long, and England will go back to Catholicism. I can't explain why people felt that, but evidently there was a general feeling. Her two half siblings, Edward VI and Mary Tudor, they didn't last very long. Edward 6 years, Mary Tudor 5 years, and then they died. So there was expectancy that Elizabeth would die young, and the country would become Catholic again. But of course, she outlived probably most of the people who predicted her to die early. She reigned for 45 years until 1603, and she was very pragmatic. She maintained control over the Church of England, but with none of the pomp, none of the kind of Catholic influence that her father, Henry VIII, had. She wanted a religious settlement that was socially and politically amenable to the people. She wanted the people to live in peace. The Anglican Church became decidedly Protestant rather than, again, as Henry VIII would have it, Anglo-Catholic. But still, confronted by Calvinist Puritans, Elizabeth did not give in to their demand of purification of all forms of Catholic piety. Not that she was tolerant to Catholics, but she didn't want the Puritans, this kind of diehard Calvinists, to rule the roost either. So she allowed images in churches, religious images in churches as one example, but very definitely anti-Catholic. She banned Catholicism, and still Catholicism was able to exist in a clandestine way. The Catholic noblemen would maybe harbor a priest on their estate, and people came for mass in that way. The numbers of Catholics diminished, and for a time at least, it was a rather vibrant minority. Why? Because there was a group of Catholics, they say hundreds, so it wasn't a very large group, went to northern France, to Douai-Rheims, this city in northern France, and there they set up a colony of English Catholics, opened a seminary, trained priests to go back to England and to work among the people. At one point in, I think it was 1581 or 1581, they were banned. It was a capital crime to be a priest in England and helping a priest in England. Of course, a priest who's practicing, who's giving the sacraments. We remember Douai-Rheims because of the old translation of the Bible. Before 1960, it was a standard English translation of the Bible, the Douai-Rheims Bible. But anyway, it was this place in France where they trained it. Now, just as a kind of an interesting point, there were Catholics who, believed in the truths of the Catholic Church, had loyalty to the popes, but they went to Protestant services when it was mandatory. I guess Sundays and holy days, like in some places you have to vote. In Elizabethan England, you had to go to church on these days or face possible prosecution. And these ones who went to church were called recusants. Recusants. I think I have it. Recusants. It's sometimes we think of judge recusing themselves. That means they take their, they don't want to try a case. Judges in the United States, they excuse themselves because of for some personal reason. In this case, the recusants were Catholics who didn't go to the services. Some Catholics, again, having loyalty to the Pope, but wanting to avoid trouble for themselves, they went to the religious services, you know, signed the attendance list and went home. They were called church papists, just to give you a sense that how Catholics dealt with this anti-Catholic bias and laws that they had, that Elizabeth had in place. So in the 1580s, the laws were made against missionary priests, and in the course of the 20 years or so, the last 20 years of Elizabeth's reign, there were 180 priests, and some of the ones who helped the priests, they were executed because they either officiated at the sacraments the priests or helped the priests do that. Another significant group of priests, besides the diocesan priests trained at Douay-Rheims, were the Jesuits. And we all remember people like Edward Campion, Jesuit martyr in England. They also did much pastoral work in the late 16th century. By the end of Elizabeth's reign in 1603, Catholicism in England was reduced to a relatively small minority of believers. So Elizabeth was successful in suppressing Catholicism. By the end of her reign, there was no threat that Catholicism was going to take over the country again. Okay, we want to go and talk about the terrible development in Germany, the 30 Years' War. Now, tried to get some sense of what was going on in Germany. Of course, Germany was where Luther began the Protestant Reformation. He got the support of princes. And because of that, because of the support of princes, there was a lot of Protestant, Lutheran missionary activity in different parts of Germany, not throughout the whole country. Germany was a divided country. The Holy Roman Emperor, for many of these years, Charles V, was Catholic, and he wanted the whole empire to be Catholic. But the princes had some political power, and eventually it turns out that they kind of defeat the Holy Roman Emperor. We'll see this at the end of the section. So the princes, they support Luther's. Some of them supported Lutherans, and others, other princes and the people were supportive of the Holy Roman Emperor, again, Charles V, a staunch Catholic. There was a war broke out between Charles V and the German Lutheran princes, and they formed what was called the Schmalkaldic League, and the war started in 1547. Charles V was able to deal a decisive blow to the Schmalkaldic League, and for a while it looked like that Catholicism would again become the religion of the whole country. But evidently, a few years later, in 1552, the Lutherans went on the attack, and they were able to deal politically, diplomacy, to have peace in the country called the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which set up the principle that whosever territory you're in, that is the religion of the of that territory. Now, the Holy Roman Emperor had his own territories, so where he was, in the case of Charles V, at least, there would be Catholicism, but different princes had their own territories. And this is a famous principle. If you're looking at your notes, cuius regio, eius regio. Whoever is the who rules in a place, the place follows that person's religion. Okay, now Calvinism did spread into Germany from Switzerland, but it never had much of a foothold until after this war that was waged between the Roman Emperor, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and the Schmalkaldic League. After that, some of the princes became, Lutheran princes, became somewhat discontent with Lutheranism. Lutheranism was always a bit halfway between, say, Calvinism and Catholicism. Remember, Luther believed in the presence of Jesus in the sacrament. He accepted some images in church, which of course the Reformed Protestant church, Zwingli and then Calvin, they didn't want any of that. You had communion, but this was more like a banquet. We have this, in a sense, of tension. The Catholic theology says that the Eucharist is both. It's both a banquet and a sacrifice. Well, Calvinists, there are no sacrifice. There's no altar. You have a little communion table, but no altar where the sacrifice takes place. Anyway, these Protestant princes, they became disenchanted with Lutherans, and they started to, some of them anyway, wanted to take on the Calvinists, a kind of a pure form of Protestantism, and really reacting against the Catholic Church. I have it was not the first time non-Catholic Christians were given official political and legal recognition. This is think about the Treaty of, or the Peace of Augsburg. Calvinism was not recognized, though. This is again in 1555. Okay, the Lutherans became divided over how to live with Catholic. Lutheranism itself did not produce the religious fervor that Luther preached. Some Lutheran princes opted for Calvinism as a pure Protestantism. And then we see a phenomenon starting to take place, which will grow, and this is confessionalization. Confessionalization is the indoctrination of the people to live according to the faith of that area. In Catholic areas, of course, it was the Catholic religion, and people, everyone, had to get in line and learn their catechism and come to Mass on Sundays, and have a sense that the Catholicism is the true religion. If you were in a Lutheran, they had to go to their services. They were told that Lutheranism is a pure and the Catholics are superstitious. So it's this kind of indoctrination that showing that your faith tradition is the true tradition, and everyone in the area would believe in the same way. Confessionalization is the process where states and churches work together to establish distinct and strong Christian traditions. The state also aids the church in this indoctrination process. It became prominent in Germany after the Peace of Augsburg and hardened the divisions between Lutherans and Catholics, and in the end, between Lutherans, Catholics, and the Reformed Protestants. After 1550, Catholicism began to regain strength in Germany. For a while, of course, after Luther, much criticism of the church. After 1550, the church is starting to reform, started to do things in the right way, and so it started to regain people, not losing people to Protestantism. We give three reasons for this. First of all, the priests became better educated. There was started in Rome the German college where Jesuits would train diocesan clergy, the faith, how to preach, a proper priestly spirituality, so that they went back. When they went back to Germany, they could show the people what it means to be a Catholic. The Jesuits themselves in Germany, they started to multiply and start schools. By the 1630s, the Jesuits started when about 1532, and in 100 years, kind of a long time, but still, they had 65 colleges, say mostly high schools, in Germany in 1630, and 3,000 Jesuits, which is probably now there may be 500 if there are that many in Germany. But in the 17th century, they had 3,000. So it was a growing, and the Jesuits again were the well-trained, the well-educated, the well-disciplined people who could teach and preach the faith. So it was that was a great boost to German Catholicism. And then Bavaria. Bavaria is the area, southern Germany. Pope Benedict XVI came from Bavaria, very Catholic, and the princes there were serious about the religion, and they helped the church form a good, a strong sense of Catholic identity. So those three reasons, there was a rebirth, say, of German Catholicism. But all of this, renewal kind of had a downside. And this was that there was going to be a war. It began in 1618 when the Protestant, and in this case, he was actually a Reformed Protestant, Frederick let's see if I got the name here, Frederick V, was proclaimed King of Bohemia. Bohemia, we know that, we think of as Czechoslovakia today. And the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick II, also made a claim to that monarchy. And so there was war between Frederick II and the Holy Roman, Frederick V and the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II. This local skirmish developed into this devastating 30-year war. The conflict involved most of the states of Europe. Again, at first anyway, the Catholic countries like Spain, they would support the Holy Roman Emperor. I don't know if the Holy Roman Emperor was the King of Spain as well. It's certainly Charles V was. I'm not sure about Ferdinand, although I suspect that he was. But anyway, Spain would support the Holy Roman Emperor, and Sweden and the those Scandinavian countries, they would support the Protestant princes. For a while, it seemed that the Catholic forces of the emperor had the upper hand and religious unity might be restored. And then entered full force the King of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, who was a brilliant military commander. He came to Germany with a relatively small army, and because he was such a competent general, able to win wars and pick up more soldiers. And before you know it, he had a force of almost 200,000 soldiers, which is, it's like a modern army today. It was quite unique at the time. And they were able to exist by pillaging the land. So these weren't armies that had the support from their native country, the Swedish army. No, they got their pay from the land, from the people, and of course the people were suffered. Then in about 15, I think it was in 1542, I don't have the date, Gustavus Adolphus was killed in battle. But what gave the Protestants victory was France and Cardinal Richelieu, who was the French, the one who made all the decisions. He wasn't king. He was a cleric, a priest. He supported the Protestants, and because of his support, France, a country that was relatively free from devastation from war, they were able to give the Protestants leverage so that they could negotiate a peace that was favorable to them. This is the Peace of Westphalia. We don't talk about the Treaty of Westphalia because it was a series of treaties, and it was called the Peace of Westphalia. And this pretty much said the same terms as the Peace of Augsburg in 1542. Now we're talking about 1548. 30 Years' War began in 1618. Now it's 1648. Except this time, Reformed Protestant churches were given recognition. Same thing, cuius regio eius religio. The one who's the ruler of the place, his religion would be the religion of that territory. And so now you had Catholic territories, Lutheran territories, and Calvinist territories, Reformed Protestant territories. What about the Anabaptists? Remember the Anabaptists, those radicals? They always existed on the side. They were pretty much, they didn't want to mess with politics, and they didn't want to be bothered by politics either. So there was no question about them giving this, taking over territory. They were in small enclaves by themselves. Pope Innocent X said that this Peace of Westphalia was terrible. He condemned it. He says it was the worst thing possible. All kinds of condemnations, but nobody listened to him. And it just shows that religion was no longer prominent like it was, say, 200 years earlier in the 15th and in the 16th century. Religion seemed to be cause of a lot of trouble. I said that Germany was decimated. A good portion of its population was killed. Nothing the likes of this would be seen until World War I. And remember how devastating World War I was. And of course, World War II even more so. So this was kind of like the first of the modern wars. But in any case, the point is people didn't want to fight to the death for religion anymore, and religion kind of came to an ebb at this point. People were tired of warfare. Not to say that religion wasn't important. As a matter of fact, we're going to see this renewal of religion in France. The state was more and more able to control the church. There wasn't this equality between clerics and politicians. Okay. Let's see where time is. Oh, we have plenty of time. We'll go into the Great French Century, Faith in the Modern Age. This is a picture, of course, of St. Vincent de Paul, who his spirituality permeated this age, a great deal of social concern, concern for training of priests and need for priests, good priests was seen at that time. Okay, the Great French Century, the 17th century, Louis the King became king, I think, in 1643, and he remained king until 1750. So he ruled for 72 years. It's kind of a record for length of reign of any modern European king. 5 years, for the first 5 years of his life, he wasn't king. Okay, and of course he was known as the Sun King and the one who this kind of what was it? What's the term that they use? The king. I forget the exact term, and I don't think I have it here. But the all-powerful king, and Louis XIV was the model of it. As they said, they called him the Sun King because he was the brightest light out there. Okay. This time in the 17th century, along with the strong monarch, we have a renewal of Catholicism in France. Vincent de Paul, of course, promoted missions, the training of clergy and social work. He founded the Daughters of Charity, those sisters that have hospitals in so many places around the world. There was new religious congregations, important religious congregations that still exist today. Our Christian Brothers were formed during this time by St. John Baptist de La Salle. The Trappists reformed the Cistercian monks. Remember, the Cistercian was a reform of the Benedictines in the, I think it was the 12th century. And then now in the 17th century, the Trappists reformed the Cistercians. The French Oratory was founded by a Cardinal Bruel, who had a new spirituality, founded that in this time. And then another significant religious order, and there were many more, women as well as priests, as well as men, but the Sulpicians. The Sulpicians were a religious congregation made up of men who would train, work in seminaries and administer seminaries for the training of priests. So a lot of religious activity, Catholic religious activity in France in the 17th centuries. There were also some very interesting theological questions at this time. Actually, before this time, but the arguments carrying on into the 17th century. They started in the 16th. The first was the correct interpretation of grace. Now, it may sound theological, abstract. You might wonder what's important. Well, it's important because it concentrated a lot of attention at the time, and we have a sense of some of the rivalries that we have in the church today. The Jesuits and the Dominicans. Dominicans were always considered the great theologians in the church, especially philosophical theologians. But when the Jesuits started, they quickly became recognized as formidable theologians too. Interestingly, the Jesuits adopted St. Thomas Aquinas. So the Dominicans, who had Thomas in their tradition, by the way, tomorrow is the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas. The Jesuits, the Dominicans would certainly want to champion Thomas Aquinas, and the Jesuits did as well, but they started interpreting Thomas in different ways. And the big issue of contention was, how does grace work? And we have to, I'm going to take a little drink of water. When we think about it, we have to wonder, if God is almighty and he gives grace, is it possible for a person to refuse the grace given by God? Or aren't we human people? This is the other side of that. Aren't we human people or human persons and making decisions about what we want and don't want? Well, the latter position is more Jesuit, and the first position is more Dominican. I should read my notes so I think it'd be a little clear. The Jesuit and Dominicans accuse one another of heresy regarding the incorrect interpretation of grace. Trent only taught that grace leads the person to meritorious works. Does the individual have to cooperate with the grace offered to him or her, or is it not the grace of God that accomplishes salvation, kind of forcing that person to do good works? The Jesuit hero, in this case, the former formator of the original formator of the doctrine, Luis de Molina, laid the stress on personal freedom in salvation. They call it, Molinist followers argued that the human person is free to accept or reject the saving grace from God. Evidently, there is some discrepancy of what Molina said in the 16th century and what his followers, they kind of brought it farther in the 17th century. It maintains sovereignty. It maintains God's sovereignty. This is the Jesuit way of thinking, by postulating that God knows in advance what the person will do, how that person will decide, and provides only the proportionate amount of grace. So again, this is a little bit of the way God knows in advance, so he only gives the grace to the people so that enough grace so that the person can make a decision. That's the way they maintain God's sovereignty over everything. The Dominican Domingo Bañez, Dominic Bañez, Domingo is just the Spanish way of saying Dominic, taught that God's will is omnipotent and omnicausal, omnicausal, that it suffices for everything. There's no human cooperation. He seems to maintain human freedom by saying that God always works apart from natural causality. So yes, humans make decisions, but that's not important. It's God who's working all along to produce this result. And Molina would say, no, it is important. The person might deny God's grace. So you had two different, and the two positions are really irreconcilable. How do we at one time say God is his providence determines everything, and at the same time give a meaningful sense of human freedom of will? This is a mystery, and I suppose it's. Some people think this is a contradiction, which kind of disproves Christianity, but it's something that all of the theologians, certainly Augustine, kept in mind. And God works differently. God doesn't work like a human. We can't kind of use our dynamics, human dynamics, to talk about how God works. God is beyond this. We just kind of struggle to understand what God is doing. So the matter was never resolved, and the papal decree by Paul V, I forget, I don't have the year of the decree, said that that both sides were right, and he just said that they should stop accusing one another of heresy, the Dominicans and theologians. So the Pope never came down on one side or the other. Okay, another more kind of serious and lasting issue at this time was the question of Jansenism. Now, I don't hear much talk about Jansenism today, but listening to confessions, we have some, say, vestiges of Jansenism in our society. Jansenism is taken from the name of the Dutch theologian Cornelius Jansen, who, following his interpretation of St. Augustine, says that, it's very hard to get to heaven. You have to be very, very careful, very, very cautious on what you do, because most people are going to be damned, and if you're not, you have to be really scrupulous about how you live. This is kind of the mentality of the Jansenist mentality. So people lived in a great fear of damnation from God. Now, it's kind of, it's difficult. It's hard to reconcile that with our sense of a loving God who waits for us to be saved. The Jesuits were the great antagonists of Jansen and Jansen's followers, and they were always making a case for exceptions or a kind of a way to, in these situations, in a sense, making excuses, but trying to give a reason that people sometimes seem to do condemnable things, and yet they really didn't mean them to be malicious. So the Jesuits kind of opposed this idea of Jansenism. But Jansen's, on the other hand, they had a strong following too. As a matter of fact, one of the great Catholic thinkers of in our history, Blaise Pascal, an excellent mathematician, philosopher, he thought that the Jansenists, he thought along Jansenist lines. And for a number of reasons, the Cistercians nuns monastery, or if you will, abbey at Port Royal in France, is always considered the bastion of Jansenism, even though the place was destroyed because the French king Louis XIV was tired of this this way of thinking and this confrontation with the Jesuits. Louis XIV, by the way, had a Jesuit confessor, and so the Jesuits had a kind of in with the king, and the king did away with this center of Jansenist thinking. But he didn't do away with Jansenism. As I say, it is still among us today. Evidently, it became very prominent in Ireland. Many Irish Catholics are very scrupulous, live in this kind of fear of hell. We've all heard of fire and brimstone sermons. Well, this is what Jansenism leads to. But it was suppressed in France, as I said, by Louis XIV. In Holland, a Jansenist church separated from Rome, weakening Catholicism with intellectual and social revolutions in the wings. So Catholicism was not quite so strong to defend itself when there was a great kind of secularism, or at that time it was more a deism, to come to take place in the age of the Enlightenment, in the latter part of the, in the 18th century. Okay, a third issue, that theological issue, something that we're probably more acquainted with, was the question of science disproving what was thought to be biblical truths. It started with the Polish, I think he was a priest, Nicholas Copernicus, who lived from, wait a minute, excuse me. I'm jumping in myself. I want to talk about quietism before I talk about the scientific revolution. Quietism was this, it turned out to be condemned, although there are defenders of the formulator of quietism who say that he was just misunderstood. Anyway, quietism is this sense that, you don't have to do anything to be saved. What you got to do is to contemplate, to think like God. That's all that's necessary. I guess you don't do anything wrong, but you don't do anything good either. But this was what it was about. Eliminated the need even of sacraments and taught a mysticism of total passivity in relation to God. You just let God come and take over your mind, and this is what brings salvation. It was formed by the Spanish priest Miguel de Molinos, 17th century, you see the date, 1628 to 1696. He wrote that the perfect Christian is a contemplative who abandons himself completely to God to the extent that pure faith leaves behind all effort to live virtuously and even to repel temptation. So you're going to have these temptations, but so on. Just keep on thinking, contemplating about God. It sounds rather like New Ageism, perhaps, or hardly what most of us are taught about the need to serve. Okay, he and his ideas were eventually condemned, and Molinos, to his credit, he repented of them. He said, okay, I was wrong. He wanted to live in the church, and so he repented of those ideas. So those are three theological issues in the 17th and 18th century. Actually, all of them, I guess, were more 16th and 17th, but anyway, 17th century issues. Okay. A scientific revolution. We'll just talk about any questions. Okay. The scientific revolution, I already started this. Copernicus, this Polish priest in the 16th century. He finally he by his observations and I think mathematical calculations said that the Earth, the sun does not revolve around the Earth, but rather the Earth revolves around the sun, and we have day and night because of its spinning. And he had this theory worked out, but he didn't publish it until just before his death. He knew this was going to cause a problem because it conflicts with, some biblical stories. And then Galileo, 100 years later, he says that Copernicus was right, and he's quite strong in his assertion about the Earth going around the sun and not vice versa. And we probably know how he was put in house prison and he had these investigations. I believe he died in conformity with the church. He didn't persist, as far as I know, in his way or no way. Of course, he was right. One of the problems was because you can say that it's the Earth that goes around the sun, but how can you prove it? You can give some analogies, but there's there's no kind of clear proof of that. It always makes, we see the sun rise in the morning and set in the evening, and we think, yeah, the sun is going around the Earth. This is what common sense tells you. So, and then of course the scripture said that. So the church maintained its side, and because it was scriptural, because there was scriptural attestation of this, they said that Galileo was wrong. But it was a difficult position for the church because it realized that these people were geniuses, and they did come to a conclusion, and they could show through different demonstrations and mathematical calculations why they believe such things. Eventually, of course, the church said that that there's a difference between what the church teaches as theological truth and what science teaches as scientific truth. And there really is no contradiction between the two. What we see in the Bible, the Earth going around the sun is, the sun going around the Earth. It is not proposed as science. Is proposed for some religious reason. This is what the people saw, and so that's what they recorded. Okay. Galileo, from the controversy, we learn, and I just said that scientific truth and religious truth extend to different realms of existence. They are not incompatible, but they treat different kinds of experience. And so we don't have to really worry about science disproving God. When science starts to talk about God, they're out of their league. Now, when the church starts to talk about subatomic particles, it's out of its league. So we shouldn't worry about being contradicted by scientists. Okay, it's 8:20. That's all the material I think I'm ready to cover tonight. I think I'm in my last slide. Are there any questions? No, everything more or less clear? Do you want me to try to explain something again?
Father?
Yeah,
I
Cindy?
didn't really write anything down about Port Royal.
Okay, Port Royal is a place, I think, in northern Spain, not too far from what would become now the Belgian border. It was a monastery of French Cistercian nuns, and it became the center of Jansenism. Cornelius Jansen was a Dutch, from the Low Countries, and so close to to northern France, and they kind of the nuns supported the Jansenists and Jansenist thinking, and it became associated with that theology, that way of thinking.
Thank you, Father.
Father, this is David.
Yeah, Dave.
Could you I was more than mildly surprised that the Dominican view of grace was in contention with the Jesuit view of grace, especially with, having their great doctor of the church, Thomas Aquinas. I wouldn't have thought he would have been far, if any, from the Jesuit position. And although you said some Pope Paul Fifth or whatever the number was settled it in a sense of just telling them to stop the
Yeah,
stop the food fight and
right. So
either one.
the accusations to one to the other, right?
Does that issue any vestiges of it today? Are they reconciled or is it forgotten for the past in terms of the differences?
This is my sense of this. There has continued to be some contention, competition between Jesuits and Dominicans. I personally think that the Jesuits have have really quite outdid every other religious order that put the rest of us order kind of to shame. I mean, they've so many vocations, so many universities in the United States. So many of the universities have medical schools. These are tremendous institutions that you can't say the Dominicans are rivals of the Jesuits. Now, say at the Second Vatican Council, though, it was to a good extent Dominican and Jesuit theologians who were the main kind of engines at the time, producing the theology which the bishops took and debated among themselves. So you had Jesuit theologians like Karl Rahner, but Dominican theologians like Yves Congar, who were prominent at the council. What was the name of the great Jesuit from France? Was also had a lot to do with forming the new theology, he called it. I'm sorry, I forget the name now. So into the 20th century, there was this great the two Dominicans and Jesuits were still kind of in the limelight of theology, not so much competition. But then precisely the same man, Karl Rahner, and others, Bernard Larnagan, Jesuit, they developed what they called a transcendental Thomism, and put this forward as if it were kind of a legitimate development of Thomas. And there was a Dominican reaction to this. The Dominicans say, what you're saying is not necessarily wrong, but don't call it Thomism. So there was this Dominicans seeing themselves as more say traditional Thomists or more legitimate Thomists than the Jesuits. So that's where they go today. The Jesuits have experienced a great deal of erosion. They've lost many vocations. They're nowhere. I don't think you can say that they're anywhere near as powerful as they once were. They still kind of dwarf the Dominicans, as a matter of fact, but they've given up, if not some of their big universities. Georgetown University no longer has a Jesuit president, and I think there are others that don't longer have Jesuit because they just don't have the number of Jesuits anymore, and most of the professors at these universities are no longer Jesuits, where at one time, at the Jesuit schools there were a lot. The faculty was to a large extent Jesuit.
On the Blessed Mother defense of her remaining sinless the rest of her life through grace, of course, I always understood it from the Catholic viewpoint of that Mary still had free will. By being immaculately conceived, did not surrender any free will. In fact, in the great Annunciation part of Luke's gospel, we more or less said that the conception didn't take place until she said, "Let it be done to me according to thy will." So God was not forcing her, and but she had the grace to almost irresistible to accept. But she, hypothetically, she did not.
Right.
So, and then on the, if you go too far, if you go a full 180 from the Jesuit position, it almost leads to some Calvinism of, if you're totally depraved or God, predestination, that virtually kills free will. Logic.
These are theological conundrums, We have to admit that. How does free will work in the presence of a all-powerful a providence, God? And we have to realize that it's impossible to explain completely well.
Sure.
That's why I was trying to think of how the Dominicans might have allowed for some, the person giving some consent, and still God being, as we said, omnipotent and omnicausal.
Well, one way
What I came is that the God works kind of in a separate realm.
Sure.
Than the humans.
Well, one way I think of, God being omnipotent and what we as humans would simply refer to as knowing the future, I see it more as everything is present to God. In our world, time is chronological. In God's world, it's ever present. There's not a chronology of time, so to speak. Certainly there wasn't before creation occurred. So that helps me to not so much reconcile it, but to.
Well, I think that's the right idea. What you're saying is a different realm. God is beyond time, and as much as time influences us, kind of cause and effect, then we exist in time in a different realm from God. That's pretty good.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, now it is 8:30, and I'm going to say good night. We'll see you next week. Read that 6th chapter, and we'll pick up next week. Let's see, with the with the political revolutions. Yeah, it gets kind of interesting in the 18th and the 19th centuries. The strong kings and
Yeah.
what their effect on the church was.
No, thanks, Father. Glad you're not.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you. Thank you,
Very
Father.
welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you.
Good night.
Perfect.
Yes. Father? He's gone.